and welcome you all to the fourth session of these lectures on social contract, in which we will have the opportunity to follow the interventions of Rogerio Tostes and Virpi Mäkinen. Let me remind the speakers that you have 30 minutes for your presentations and the rest of the attendees that you can ask your questions through the chat. Well, I'm really glad to be able to introduce you to Professor Rogerio Tostes, one of those responsible for allowing us to meet these days to discuss the issue of EU's Resistendi. Nowadays, he's collaborating researcher at Interdisciplinary Center for History, Culture and Societies of the University of Évora. He is PhD in medieval history with a thesis defended a few months ago at the University of Lleida under the direction of Professor Fleucel Sabater. His main research lines focus on the study of parliamentarism and political theories, especially in the late medieval Crown of Aragon. Today, he's going to present us a paper entitled Resist the Tyrant, a theological-political view of Francesc Eiximenis. You have the floor, Rogerio. We can hear you.
No, sorry, this detail. Again, good morning, everybody. I'm very glad to see so many faces and a few brave colleagues from Brazil. Today I want to present my paper on Eiximenis, and first I'd like to share my. Just a sec. Where it is? Why it's not? It's weird. I'm trying to share my. Why not? Why not appear? Ah, here. Okay. You can see my.
See.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Then the next. Oof. This is a bit awkward. How I can have the text? Okay. Wait. Yeah, I guess. Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, not so practical. Should be a problem. Excuse me. Oh, I can. No. Oh, yeah. Well, let's try here. Well, in today's presentation, I will speak about a Franciscan friar from the second half of the 14th century, the Genoese friar called Francesc Eiximenis. He has been treated as a mere follower of the great Franciscan masters, and all of that despite his broad philosophical sensibility. However, one of most recognized of his merits is, among other things, for Eiximenis' talents to synthesize the problems of those masters on the institutional praxis found in the Mediterranean frameworks, in which were the great capitals linked to the authority of the Aragonian dynasty. As Paulo Evangelisti has repeatedly pointed out, Fray Eiximenis represents one of the many names of the Franciscan order who ended up being engaged by these rulers to act actively in the government and in the political advice of the Respublica. This particularity gives the Dionysian works a very prominent character in view of their influence on the models of government and on the rulership exercised for next kings of Aragon, as happened especially to Alphonse I Magnanime. For this seminar, I will focus on a subject that has been widely repeated, but just generally in Eiximenis' doctrine, the one of resistance to tyrannical power. If I'm allowed to observe, this specialized line on Eichimenian study has ignored a point that makes the friar's interpretation an unusual view in comparison to the major works of Marsilio and Occam. I refer first to the point proposed by Eiximenis to overcome the boundaries between Roman law and obedience to divine justice, and secondly, I want to point out that this review made by Eiximenis occurs thanks to the previous connotations of freedom attributed to individuals and especially to the political community as a whole. Both of these points help to understand Eiximenis' use Resistendi conception and its own constitutional remedies. The constitutional pact proposed by Eiximenis and the preceding Franciscan masters presupposes a quasi-voluntarist intention on the part of the community. I'm talking, of course, on how a new perception of potentia agendi was put on the individual's ability to discern from what was considered good or bad choices, or to between illicit and licit actions displayed by the whole community for using its decision-making power. This intellectual capacity of society members gains a newer connotation during the second half of the 14th century, when the common good is projected onto commercial practice, giving moral action a factual plane of understanding between useful or useless actions for the benefit or disadvantage of the collective well-being. This is the same model thought by Occam to grant validity to institutional artificia of human inventiveness, subdatem percolationem humana, in Occam's words. In other words, this theory evolved from a conception of private property to a notion of collective ownership, in which all men are inscribed in the forms of dominion created secundum necessitatem temporis, and not anymore but the unchanging order of things. Consequently, any obstacle imposed by the prince on the lawful and legitimate use of free individual acts should imply a primary institutional pact. Measuring the range of these obstacles may foster a rediscussion of the fair limits allowed to monarchical power. In other words, the Augustinian potestas has been transformed into the faculty of rector jurisdictione habens, while its legislative role ascended to a new category of judicial privileges constituted by the community sovereignty. Going back to the notion of service attributed to the monarchical role as recognized by John of Wales, the princeps was defined according to the designation rex qui quod est utile subditorum. It means the king which is useful for his subjects. While William of Ockham, on the other hand, approached the same notion to give more exactitude to the limits of the first subordination to the priestly authority, justifying this subservience only when the public authority is necessary to govern justly and beneficially people as a subject itself. He also says, however, that subjects are free from any type of obedience, and consequently, they can resist the prince's tyrannical dominion. And I want to pass here, This, with these indications, it makes clear to put the understanding of moderate form of princely power, shared especially by Franciscan friars until the first half of the 14th century. The horizon of these positions added by the Franciscans transformed the hierarchical distribution of the things created on earth. From the restraint of divine law over human action was the inclusion of it in a temporal order, redefining civil government as a responsibility conferred by community delegation. Thus, supported by this understanding of authority, Eiximenis said that the subjects of a kingdom could remove the prince from his throne, as the Sicilians did to Charles d'Anjou. Here I have my second fragment. Who they consider a tyrant, justifying the legitimacy of their deposition merely by natural reason and by Christian law, which is founded on charity and by the laws of the land. Per raó natural i per llei cristiana que és fundada en caritat i per furs propris de la terra. So, if what really sustained the authority of kings and emperors depended more on the artificial bonds created by the community than on the landlord's obligation, justified in this case by the co-naturality among suzerain and vassals, there is no pact that did not rely on theology and law. This moderation depended on the conception of self-sufficiency of community disseminated in the late medieval political vocabulary. William of Ocken's examination on the matter had attributed to the individual subject a faculty for freedom as its inherent quality, giving it an even more elaborate definition than previously defined by Olivi and Scotus, his illustrious precedents. And he says, voluntas respecto quoisquunque object libere te contingetur agit, igitur simpliciter de potentia sua absoluta potest cessare ab acto suo. In other words, a way was opened for the self-determination of the subject of the free will. Finally, with the change in the nature of authority due to the recognition of subject freedom, the ordinary procedures previously employed in decision-making schemes were re-evaluating the models of exercise of political power. In a scenario in which the necessitas would not only become the starting point of the manifestation of the prince's fullness of power, but also the moment when the community returns to its status nacendi, and when it creates a lapse for the ordinary institutions to be suspended, the mere multitude would take over power to decide during the period of exception. Secundum quod necessitas et qualitas temporis unum principatum vel alium exigit et requirit. But what kind of threat or danger was that, in Ocken's view, which jeopardized the integrity of the republic and contra utilitatem populi? This cause rested on the legitimate opposition of the subjects to the prince's abusive power, including his deposition by the use of violence, quia regnum in casu necessitatis potest regen suum deponere et in custodia detinere vir repellere. The Occamian philosophy opened the door to a constitutional paradigm that would, at least theoretically, surpass the old frames of the feudalizing scheme in order to define the primacy of community interests as a substantial evidence of authority. The terms that had been fixed by Ocken about the nature of seigneurial obedience were gradually referred to the rationalization structures which prioritize the interests of res publica, without which the duties of subjection faded, giving the subject citizens the effect of resisting the princely iniquity. Eiximenis seems to have followed the doctor Invencibilis, but using a subtler rhetoric, given the environment in which his texts circulated and the closeness he had to the monarchs of Aragon. Under the idea of Pactism, customary issues such as the limitation of potestas and the deposition of the king had received a specific discursiveness in addressing the institutional experience of the parliaments, from which Eiximenis drew many of his examples. In his rhetoric, a subreptitious argument is made about the virtue of the ruler, which is beginning to be vaguely exposed in the manner of traits of the general, urging the construction of order and peace depends on the fact that the ruler inspires trust and loyalty among those with whom he lives. However, in advancing this argument of the defense of fidelitas as the supreme bond of the political body, one recognizes the risk that the monarchy brings by betraying the good faith that sustains the community. Thus, this prince loses the heart of the subjects, and consequently, the public good goes down and drain. Ai tal princa perd tot lo cor dels subtes i per conseqüent la cosa pública va a terra. In this case, the sovereign's impetus is the cause of public scandal and endangers the collective salvation. This is why Eiximenis, who had read Salisbury and absorbed much of his vocabulary, emphasized the autorità della lei to punish the evil king. The distinction between the prince and the tyrant, drawn by John of Salisbury, already had the same notion assimilated by the Eiximenis argument. In this notion emerged a necessity or sovereignty subordination to the law instituted by the Republic. Excuse me. Yes, this is right. Just, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, this is the fragment. Sorry, I want to compare the fragment of Salisbury. As Eiximenis assumed, under the sign of ignominy, the tyrant dishonors the high dignity of the Holy Vicariate and corrupts both divine and human laws. And of all members of the community, he is the first to break the commandment he has sworn to protect. This reasoning prepares the following definition of the problem of tyranny. Tyrant es quasi diabla. No, the tyrant is quasi-devil. Eiximenis says, heading a long list of courses which were taken from the biblical repertoire. In following these arguments, he recovers the Thomistic criteria to frame the predicates of the tyrannical principality, governed by someone who seek only for their own good and not for the good of the community. Cerc solament son profit propi i no de la comunitat. The tyrant's affront is best explained by denouncing his way of acting in view of the subjects, to whom the principle of natural freedom is not respected, treating the citizens of the Republic as slaves and also subjecting them to grave abuses. Eiximenis went on to say that the tyrant has neither law nor custom. Lo tiranno ten lei, ne fur, ne costuma. His government consists in defrauding the community's treasure as if it were his private property. Given these notions, it is simple to conclude that it is better that this man and his whole house be limited or even removed as a dynastic rulership. But what is the meaning of this deposition, other than tyrannicide? Eiximenis circumvents the final answer to the issue as much as he could by listing the many palliatives that may contain the abuse of power before he chose a capital execution for the king. He speaks allegorically through the mouth of Gervasius, a fictional patriarch of Alexandria, who advises the consuls of Pisa to confront a tyrant who had usurped their republican power. And to contain this tyrant, Gervasius has advised to arrest him, thus depriving his liberty, and the immoral prince could also be expelled from his domain by being thrown out of the lands of the kingdom. However, if all those measures failed, Eiximenis would not hesitate to acknowledge that the representatives of communities should wage the supreme power and order the execution of anyone who broke the members' confidence of the fetus of the political body, which also includes the prince. Si vostre tirant es public invasor de la vostra cosa pública i no avets a qui recorrer, no hi ha altre remei que hi façat segons que justícia requer i raó natural consella, i les lleis imperials han ordenat que se'n faça. Com vosaltres ajats administració de la vostra cosa pública, podets veure clarament llegut vos es procedir contra els vostres malfectors per autoritat de la llei i de fer en ells complidament de justícia. If your tyrant is a notorious invader of your cosa pública and you have no one to request for support, there's no other remedy than to act according to what justice requires and is advised by natural reason, and also the imperial laws have ordered that it be done. As you have power to rule your public affairs, you can clearly see that it is your duty to prosecute against the malefactors of the law's authority and to impose on them the punishment of the justice. Although these conclusions were manifested at the end of the Dotze at Eiximenis Street, it can be said that the ground had already been trodden through the treaties. From the first chapters, the bases that conferred autarky to the civic community model were revealed, coming to qualify the types of society according to the freedom assigned to its members. In Eiximenis' explanation of the 5 kinds of corporate organization, he identifies the first as the community with the highest content of civil autonomy among its co-citizens, a direct idealization of the Italian communes. In this kind of society, each individual can use the freedom without fear and without shame, usar de sa liberdade sans pao e sans vergonha. But if for whatever reason someone was to rise up against the balance of the common good, their members would be entitled to proceed against him, as he would be an enemy of the head of the republic, and just as he entered the capital freedom of it. In the second kind of community, called the Society of Politics Vassals, Eiximenis started to describe the type of society that constitutes the Crown of Aragon. It means Crown of Aragon, in this case, it's represented by a second range of this, hierarchy of evolved societies. Well, in the society, the Society of Political Vassals, the subjects do not possess the same level of equity as the people of Italian communes. Eiximenis argues that the singulars or individuals are legitimately free. Romanam purament francs de franchesa civile e politica, something can come to support thanks to lawful argument extracted from Roman law. The quotation made by Eiximenis, and here is interesting because it includes some fragment where he made a direct citation. This citation made by Eiximenis corresponds to Florentines' text, integrating the section De Statu Homini, which prescribes the conditions that can convert a free man into a slave. These are the same arguments used by Eiximenis to justify the freedom of community members and consequently their legal capacity to institute common pacts and laws. Due to the inherent freedom of humankind, at the beginning of civil societies, the peoples have set their pacts and laws for peaceful coexistence. And only after that, they elected a regidor, a ruler, to occupy the sovereignty command of community, giving him the position of public protector and commonwealth's head. At the same time, these princeps must be committed to maintaining the civil caritat, the charity, and the material enrichment of the unicum that makes up the whole community. In this sense, the biggest crime committed by the tyrant is the affront to this constitutional foundation of society, corrupting the populace freedom and illicitly appropriating the arcs of the republic as if they were his own treasure. And here, ok. Nós pensávamos que tu fosses para regir-nos, mas tu não és, segundo que par. Nós t'havíem dat competent e notable patrimoni amb què poguessis tenir realistament i poguessis conservar lo nostre, defendent-lo i favorent-lo, així com a bon rei. I tu has fet propi de nós i de so del nostre, així com si fossin catius teus. I pos posant Déu i consciència, the conscience is exactly this bond of foro interno, com fosses ber rei i senyor per nós elegit, este fet envers nos cruel tirant, prenent del nostre i havent elegit robador i cruel enemic nostre. The disruption of loyalty committed by the prince tyrant was not merely an abrupt act of disturbance in the political order. Worse than that, it outcomes in the continuous decrease of the constitutional guarantees given through the general norms and privileges issued in parliaments or in person by the king himself. In other words, it shows the pure fact that the king dared to issue laws of general effect without seeking the consent of the deputies assembled in parliaments. Such abuses should be corrected whenever possible to restore the disturbed order and reinstate a status quo ante. In this way, if certain processes were followed, even the tyrant could be rehabilitated from his deleterious conduct. All these measures of legal resistance to oppose against the abuse of royal delegates were recognized by the jurists of the beginning of the same century, and that had been extended, especially by Bartolus, in the exegesis left by him with the comment of the Lex Quisinter Rebellis, and later with Baldus on Concilium Rex Romanorum. No? And of course, Eiximenis was in knowledge of these references. Eiximenis had already implied the contractual or the pactist instance of parliamentary assemblies, and he also insisted on the reparative capacity of the grievances, gravamina, or as in Catalan said, greuges, to restrain all sorts of princely shortcomings, which means that the body of representatives pot demanar al tirant Corts o Parlament General. These courts constituted a privileged space for interlocution, especially for receiving the protests or grievances formulated by the heads of real estates. In effect, the greuges were an effective way of limiting royal misconduct, particularly when it was performed directly by the king or through his officers. Usually, the deputies presented their grievances through formalized protests demanding judicial redress for fraud or corruption perpetrated by royal officers, harming the public administration. As Francesc Eiximenis noted regarding the iniquities followed in the tyrannical regimen, is the king himself who covers the harmful actions of his ministers and delegates who are los majores corruptores y venedores da justicia, causing the subversion of kindly rightness and showing in the malfunction of public power a disruption of the public charity. It is well known that Eiximenis' assertions contain much of the political practice and events he witnessed during the reigns of Peter the Ceremonious and his son John I. In one case, as in others, his observations had denoted the accuracy with which he inserted some punctual criticism on the historical moment of the second half of the 14th century. For years at a time, complaints against the misconduct of royal officials were the main concern addressed in the Greuges Parliament's proceedings. In parallel, new semantic protests were created by a combined issue from the representatives in order to supervise the royal officers, while the same legal basis was used to restrict the monarch's personal veto on the collegiate decisions issued by the parliament. In the courts celebrating Perpignan in the second half of the 14th century, Peter Ceremonious accepted to subjugate his immediate officers to a new type of inquiry, presided over by the representatives of the three states of the kingdom and not by him. As early as 1379, the same King Peter bowed down to Barcelona's Jurat's requests, allowing audits of the Iudex Tabulae to approve the new officials appointed by the sovereign and agreeing to periodically control of their actions by procedures of the inquiry commission nominated Purga de Taula. Despite the advance of these regulatory instruments, the ordinary oversight had escaped the control of the inquisitors. These agents had to clash with the insubordination of judges and tax collectors accustomed to using the royal standard to impose their arbitrary actions and for escaping from public purposes, something made under the implicit counsel of the king himself. While the royal delegates were held to be responsible for the impunity of frauds and corruption offenses, the monarch insisted on broadcasting a discourse that praised the royal sceptre's regimental virtues in order to distribute high justice as an instance which covered all the jurisdiction of Principality of Catalonia. Nevertheless, this premise had the opposite effect and have increased the tensions that already existed in the fragmented jurisdictions of the Catalan domains. On the other hand, the representativities of towns and villages refused a princely interpretation on this matter, rejecting any truthfulness in royal statements about the principles of justice and equity, which Peter Ceremonious had announced as an argument to justify his interventions in the local powers by the presence of his officers. However, the common opinion among his subjects was contrary to the honorability of the monarch and his delegates. Following the advice of Eiximenis, before any commitment to the justice function of the monarchy, the reality is that they maintain their functions in the same way as they take care of themselves. Hangmen, the votes of money and mundanity. It has highlighted that the monarchy's true intentions were to increase his incomes by providing offices ministered by the tax collectors and other officials such as bailiffs and veguers. And again, citing Eiximenis, nor is there anyone among them who, no matter how many crimes they have committed, cannot take any more bribes, Eiximenis says, denouncing the impunity of those who could bargain the acquiescence of royal arbiter. All this evidence is confirmed the injustice of the royal scepter. There is no poor person here who is hurt, or widowed, or minor, not even a man of God who is attended by them, and who cannot be defended in any way. The same recognition made by Eiximenis about the legitimacy of tyrant's authority, or even the nullity of all judicial acts issued by the imposed ruler, was also accepted by general juries, who saw in this matter a way to typifying the tyrannical principality. My time has done. No? I just conclude. From an instrumental point of view, the jurisdictional distribution that the prince had so tenaciously insisted on keeping under his control become an attribute associated with the sovereignty competence of his own community. Therefore, any level of adherence to stricter grounds on the exercise and the procedure adopted were a guarantee of validity that, in the end, could compromise the final scope of parliament decisions. The pressures for the legitimacy of the acts and protocols gain strength with compendium of representative discourses from Romanist and Aristotelian Ciceronian preparatories. In conclusion, the plethora of arguments, as well as the scopes, had emerged some old institutions, verba gratia, the redress of grievances, which had long been involved in the circumstance of the tax subsidy negotiations, requested by the king. All this changing of semantic matters, all this changing of understanding was kept by Eiximenis in order to justify not just a far theory from reality, but a very sensitive perception of how to limitate it using a very specific level of discursivity in order to restrain the abuses of sovereignty power. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tostes, for your interesting presentation. And I'm sure that in the debate, we will be able to continue delving into these ideas. But first, we are going to give way to the second intervention of the session. For this, let me introduce you Professor Virpi Mäkinen. She's Senior Lecturer of Theological and Social Ethics in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki. As principal investigator, she leads the academic research project at the Frontiers of Humanity, Extreme Necessity in the History of Ethics, Law, and Politics, from the 4th century to the 16th century. Mäkinen is a member of Finnish Academy of Science and Letters and acts as a member in several editorial and academic boards in Finland and other countries. Her presentation in the seminar entitled The Maxim of Extreme Necessity and the Limits of Public Order. And without further ado, I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me here, and especially thank you for Rogerio for encouraging me to speak about extreme necessity and sending Jürgen Mietke's very interesting article as well. So I share my slides now. Okay, I'm going to speak about William of Ockham, to whom Rogerio already referred, and how Occam used, how Occam used the principle or maxim of extreme necessity in his political thought, and when he discussed about the legitimacy of resistance of a ruler. Occam's life is, of course, known of you all, but there was a quite sharp turning point from theological and philosophical themes to the politics in the early 1340s. After that, he was sent or went to the Avignon. The main theme of his political works is general critique of papal power, and especially the heretic Pope John XXII. Thus, there is no direct discussion on the secular rulership in his works, but of course he deals with secular ruler and secular themes when discussing on ecclesiastical things. Today I'm referring to his works Opus Nona Quintadierum, which he wrote concerning the Franciscan poverty, debate against the Pope 22nd, and then short discourse on tyrannical government, Dialogus, and Octo Questiones. First, some notes about the early history of the principle, or we also can call it a maxim of extreme necessity. Necessitas non habet legem. There are, of course, very many references to it in ancient philosophical works. Here I have only Publius Syrus texts, necessitas dat legem non ipsa accipit. Then there are texts from Roman legal sources, for example, from Digesta and Ulpianus. I didn't go further with these. And of course, there is a decretum, sentences of the decretum, and now I have missed to put them as well. So I introduce a little bit more the maxim, how other medieval authors used it. And I have here the example from Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologiae, because the theft, the theme or subject of theft was the most common example when theologians discussed about extreme necessity. So Aquinas asked whether it is lawful to steal by reason of necessity, and he replies, if, however, there is a necessity so urgent that it is obvious that the necessity must be met at once by whatever means are to hand. For example, if a person is in immediate danger and no other help is available, anyone can then lawfully supply his own need from the property of another by taking from it either openly or in secret. Nor, properly speaking, does this have the character of theft or robbery. So here are the main criteria for using the extreme necessity, the principle. So it should be urgent, life-threatening situation, for example, famine or plague or shipwreck, something like that. Another important criteria is that it should be met at once, as Thomas Aquinas say. So it should be short period, time of necessity, not long period in this time of medieval thought. And then there should not be no other help available. So the person is forced to take another's property, for example, in this example. There is, I have a nice example from the Nordic law, from Swedish customary law. Finland was part of Sweden in this time. So this is from my own country, Söderman's law from 1324. There is a title extreme necessity in this customary law, which states a person in need can take a maximum of 5 turnips without penalty. If someone takes more than 5 and is not in immediate need, he should pay 1 öre. This law explains that the necessity, or this maxim of necessity, was common also in customary law and in jus commune around in Europe. And of course, we know that it is used in many countries nowadays as well. For example, in Italy, there is a case from 2016 where the court used or referred to the extreme necessity of a Bulgarian refugee. Then back to Occam. He also referred to the case of theft when discussing Franciscan poverty. And in his Opus Nona Quintadierum, he writes about it. No one can renounce the natural right to use something necessary to sustain life, even something that is another's property. If we compare these to the Aquinas texts, there is an important change in Occam, because he is stating the right of necessity here. He refers to the, in these texts, he also refers to the Decretist interpretation, who, according to the Brian Turney, were the first ones who develop extreme necessity as a right of necessity, as the individual and inalienable right to subsistence. So we have it here also in Occam. In his Dialogus, he said to use what belongs to another, if you are in a case of extreme necessity, is a conditional law of nature. So these are those common examples which theologians use extreme necessity. Also, death penalty was a very common example, but I don't know how much they use it in a political context. But today I'm showing in Occam's text that the principle was also used in his political texts. However, before that, we should look at briefly the theological basis of the principle. Now there is somebody speaking. Okay, so there are theological bases, background of this principle, and they are important for our subject. So each person has the natural right to preserve one's own life. This is certain for Occam's rights, ideas of individual rights. Then the situation of extreme necessity is a retreat to the state of common possession under the original natural laws. The sentence in casu necessitates omnia sunt communia, id est communicanda is very often repeated by Occam. And this is from natural law definition from decretum. Occam refers to decretum, but originally it is from Isidore of Seville, from etymologies, and Professor Pennington already referred to it yesterday. So according to this definition of natural law, because in Decretum there are several kinds of definitions, but Occam took this. Natural law is common to all peoples because it follows everywhere by a natural instinct, not by a positive law. Such cases are the connection of man and woman, the heredity of children and the education, the common property of all. This is important here, and the common liberty of all. The right to occupy all what is caught in heaven, on earth, or in the sea, the handing back a deposit or the returning borrowed money, and for our subject, an important sentence, the defense against the violent aggression by force. For all this is never unjust, but is meant by natural and just. So we are looking for here the same sentence as Professor Pennington yesterday. And these red ones are important now when we are dealing with extreme necessity in political contexts. Then I just briefly state something very common, perhaps very common for all of you, but just as a background for Occam's ideas, the nature of social or political organization and the legitimacy of rulership. As self-preservation was important natural right for individual person, according to Occam, it is also an important aim to social and political organizations within the framework of the laws. So they aim at self-preservation. Then rulership is legitimated if and only if it sticks to the law and justice, as it is installed only in order to do right and justice. As Rogerio already referred when he spoke about Occam, the goal of social political organization is bonum commune, common good, and bonum utile, good useful for the subjects and not for an individual ruler. So Occam stress on common good for the subjects. Rulership remains to be measured for this reason by its original aim and purpose, that is the law and justice. For example, the rules should not be against the good of populum, the subjects. This is another kind of legitimate resistance reason which Occam offer in his works. If the ruler acts against the good of the people and the action for the subjects is evident, then and only then there is a legitimate resistance. And thus even the empire cannot accept obedience to any of his commands that are given against the good of the people, contra utilitatem populi, which Rogerio already stated. But when we go to another reason for legitimate resistance, for which is extreme necessity, emergency situation, we have to little bit go back to Occam's theological ideas of how human being has property rights and a right to govern others. So in his short discourse on tyrannical power, Occam explained twofold God-given power, which he divided between two kinds of states, which was very common to theologians, speak something before the fall, before the sin, in the state of origin, in the original state, and then what happens after the fall, after the sin. So before the first sin, God conferred upon human rights, and it's important that Occam refer both believers and unbelievers, a common lordship called dominium over all temporal things. But after the fall, God bestowed upon human race, and again both believers and unbelievers, the power to appropriate material things and to set up rulers with legal jurisdiction in order to live peaceful life. And here he also refers to the Aristotle's politics. The twofold power is God-given without human ministry or cooperation, because power to use material things and power to establish rulers with temporal jurisdiction are necessary and useful for living well and for sustenance and living politically good life. Here he refers, of course, bonum commune, bonum utile. In fact, actual property rights, the division of the property and jurisdictional rights were first introduced by human law. The basis of rulership is given by God, but the singular forms of its shaping are human inventions according to the contracts. Thus, the twofold power is always relevant to human affairs after sin, and in some circumstances, use of this power is obligatory. And here we come to the case of extreme necessity and the use of twofold power. In his short discourse, Occam writes, hence it is that both believers and unbelievers can renounce the above-mentioned twofold power except in a situation of necessity or of a utility comparable with necessity. For this reason also, some believers and unbelievers can be deprived of such power for some fault or reason, so that they cannot, except in a situation of necessity, rightly exercise it, and so that if in fact they try to exercise it, their act is null by the law itself. In his Octo Questiones, he returned to this case of extreme necessity and the resistance, and he states as follows. According to Occam, the emergency situation brings society back to the moment of origins and activates the contract of society in a new way. It awakens the power of the multitude to suspend the normal regulations as well as to generate and to change the social and political constitution for the moment, but also for a long time. Here he differs from the general or traditional interpretation of the extreme necessity, which, for example, Thomas Aquinas stated that it should be a short-term period. Here he also said that for a longer time. So the case of extreme necessity and the multitude of the people wins a potestas transmutandi principatus. Again, the emergency situation permits to everybody a violent resistance. And he even wrote that even women are allowed to use weapons in order to defend themselves and their homeland against rape and death when all men are failing in this task. So, shortly, in an emergency situation, and we all know that it is the heretical Pope for Occam. He states that if the rulers are Christians, they are obliged as Christians to intervene against any heretic, also against the heretic Pope, by using their ordinary competence. That is, to send him into prison, keep him there, wait for final judgments of the pertinent council, and after the final sentence of the general council, the prince had to execute him. And Occam conclude that even the lay people could and must participate in the persecution of heretical clerics and in any case of heretical pope. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Mäkinen, for this rich presentation. And we are now scheduled to open the debate. During this session, we have had the occasion to observe from an eminently theoretical perspective the problem of public power, the political models of rulership, the institutional model of representation, the position in front of the tyrant, or the case of extreme necessity, and the limits of public order among the interpretations made by late medieval theologians and political thinkers such as Henry Ghent, Godfrey of Fontaine's William Ockham, or Francesc Eiximenis. If you have any questions or comments, now is the time. But let me start with a reflection for Professor Tostes. Through the chapters and exempla of his treatise and the Rupture Christia, I have the feeling that Eiximenis is a bit ambiguous or even contradictory at times in relation to the reaction in front of the tyrant, from the passions to deposition or death. Do you think there is any explanatory logic for it?
Simple and mortal question. Well, he's my friend. It's difficult to say because, well, you know better than I that Eiximenis used his ability to be ambiguous in order to survive, no? But I don't know in which point we could say that it's really ambiguous. I'm thinking about this. Actually, I don't have an answer for that. Because specifically here, in the case of tyrannicide, when this is very interesting, because for me, because he put some clearly, how to say, level of choices, you know, and try to, how to say, to charge the tyrant about these crimes, and using the Roman law, which is very interesting regarding Eiximenis, because he never, or at least try to never use Roman law to justify anything, no? And even using Roman law, he remembers that this just has validity with the forum internal. I mean, the Roman law is just means something while it's connected to forum internal. No, without that, it's nothing. But in order to say, look, even Roman law authorized to kill the tyrant, then let's do it. If there's no other way, if after a lot of demolitions, he still insists in being bad, let's do it. And of course, always using this indirectly examples about his historical narratives, historical example, but in this case specifically, it's a reflection that I don't have to offer now. It's a thing. If you have some clue, I'd like to hear from you, because it also interests me now. I hear. Favor.
There's a question of José Luis Gios, yeah.
Well, thank you, both of you. I found your interventions very, very good. Well, especially because of this connection between philosophy, law, and practice that I find very, very interesting. So I have one question for each of you. You were in the materials you show concerning the thought of Eiximenis. You were referring to this question, according to which the popular resistance is licit whenever the institution in charge of controlling or deposing the tyrant doesn't intervene. but there is a small nuance that, for example, is contemplated by Aquinas, who, as you probably know, he also evaluated this question in the Regno. In the thought of Eiximenis, this popular intervention is granted as licit whenever the institution decided not to intervene or could not intervene. Because for Aquinas, as you probably know, in the Regno, he states that when the institution in charge of controlling the tyrant decided not to intervene, for example, a higher institution, the people, they could only pray, abstain from sin, etc., and pray God that is the punisher of tyrants par excellence. Yeah. So what would be the exact nuance of this aspect in Eiximenis? I don't know if you understand well the question. And my question for Mäkinen concerning extreme necessity, I have found, and this afternoon I will talk about that also, mentions to extreme necessity, but in a contrary sense, because extreme necessity in the political thought, also, for example, in the Glossators, Nicholas of Lyra, he appeals to extreme necessity as a justification of the adoption of salutary measures bordering the tyrannical measure, bordering the tyrannical regime. So are there in Ockham or in the sources you are reading and analyzing in your project also mentions to extreme necessity in this tyrannical sense? Thank you. That would be my two questions for you.
Professor Mäkinen, do you want to start?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. As far as I know, or as far as I have studied, I have not seen any examples of tyrannical sense in the context of extreme necessity. But I have to say that I have not yet studied the theme so much, and only those examples I know from political contexts are these this kind of that I already present from Ockham, and then there is another interesting example of from the context of just war, which is studied by Mikko Posti, who is now, I think he's here also as audience, from John of Naples. So these are the only one, but I'm certainly sure that there are very many examples where the authors used this principle, and my project and the researchers are looking for them. But thank you for giving us an example of Nicholas of Lyra.
Well, let me see if I understood well. In short, could it be can people directly intervene, more or less that, or not?
Well, the question was concerning when the institution could intervene in order to punish, to control the tyrant, etc. But there is a small nuance that I find very interesting. For example, in Aquinas, the Regno, an institution could or not intervene. That was one of the nuance.
Okay.
If an institution could not intervene, then for Aquinas, at least in my interpretation, popular resistance could be thought or licit. But if there was a higher institution in charge of controlling the tyrant, of deposing the tyrant, he's thinking in the Pope, in emperors, and so on, and he had decided not to intervene, then Aquinas commanded the people, well, the higher institution had decided in that sense, and you can only desist from sin, pray, and pray to God, who is the punisher of tyrants. So he has no, he's different, very different from Eiximenis and Occam. Yeah.
No, yeah. In this case, like Eiximenis is like closer to Occam than Aquinas. He looks for some effective remedies, but he avoids as much as possible to authorize any popular initiative. In the case, he believes, he trusts that the parliament, or this is 3 states reunited in parliaments, where they call courts in Peninsula Iberia, could take the decision. And it's a very, I mentioned, unfortunately not with more detail, but this institution of presentatio de greuge, which is instrument of reparation, which is used in all the parliaments, medieval parliaments, was very well developed in Crown of Aragon. And Eiximenis really believed that it could really, how to say, repair the abuses of. And it's interesting because in case of Crown of Aragon, happened to be an exchange for favors, for taxes. No, the king was mostly desperate for some, really desperate, because his personal treasure like very low, and he had accepted. He accepted even punish his officers most of the time, and the level of corruption of his officers was very, how to say, well known by all the subjects. But Eiximenis believes in some standard of society, and especially in the oligarch groups that we call bourgeois, par excellence. But he don't believe that the people could manage to have this, how to say, this autonomy. All the autonomy of popular autonomy should be managed by the representatives in the courts, in the parliaments, and it's where the magic happens, and where the king can be convinced of his crimes and seek for some remission. But this is basically, Eiximenis works with very different situations where he says clearly that the king, even, and Paul Evangelista is here, I hope he's gonna say something, but Evangelist worked exactly in a situation when the king can be punished to change the currency, and the king can be punished by lesa majestatis. It's a very uncommon view, and then we see that the vocabulary, the circumstances, the institutions are more or less the same, of course, but the Eiximenis are very creative in adapting this in the circumstances of the Crown of Aragon. And this is my point. Eiximenis is often accused to be not very original as a philosopher, but he even had the pretension to be a philosopher in an academic way. He really wanted to be practical in taking the conversation of yesterday, theory, practice, but this is the case. Then he really intends to intervene. He does not just asking to people to pray. No, he really wants to take real measures.
There is a last question from Paolo Evangelisti. So, Professor, please.
I completely agree with Rogerio about the definition of the character of Eiximenis. He was not a philosopher, but in my opinion, it's truly a politic man, and he acted as a politic counselor, I think. And just to support the magnificent relation of Rogerio, I just to share with all of us, if it's possible to share something or not. Probably not.
Sorry, Paulo? You want to share my... you want to see back the PowerPoint?
Yes, only one slide is possible.
Of course.
I can't find the bottom. Okay.
Okay. Which one is this?
This one. Okay. Is readable? All can read?
I can read.
You can read?
I can.
Okay.
Nós pensávamos que tu fosses para regir-nos, mas não és, segons que par. Nós t'havíem dat competent i notable patrimoni amb què poguessis tenir realistament i poguessis conservar lo nostre, defendent-lo i favorent-lo, així com el bon rei, i tu has fet propi de nós i de sol del nostre, així com si fóssim catius teus, i posposant Déu i consciència, com fossis ver rei i senyor per nós elegit. Este fet envers nos cruel tirant, prenent del nostre i havent elegit, crec que elegit rol robador i cruel enemic nostre. I miss the most appropriate should be a Juncosa read, but okay, I'm doing my best in this morning.
No, probably. Sorry, it's not the same slide. So no, it's just to say that in another two chapter in the Dotsé, we can read a special statement that say that all the people, all the community can examine and charge the Señor, not the king, et sotmetraste a nostra raó e giui. And this is very important, just as a systematic way, Eiximenis way, about the responsibility of the senior that is never named with the term king, and that I was to underline just to support your important position. And I have only a question to Professor Mäkinen, and sorry. When you cite is about Occam, the potestas transmutandi principatus, it means more or less something as a constitutional time. I mean, a time of in which all law is suspended for a new order, like modern constitutional era, or is an anachronism? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So was it a question or just a notion?
I mean, if we consider this potestas transmutandis principatus as a constitutional time, okay?
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there's not any other question, before going to it, I would like to reiterate my thanks to the speakers and all participants, and we will meet again in more or less an hour. So thank you very much.